Israel is not a state of all its citizens, but rather the nation-state of the Jewish people and only them.
Because the people of Ukraine are not pawns in anyone's political game. They're not to be used by rulers of superpowers.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. Connecticut politicians are among the worst with their lack of sympathy for Palestinian rights. They vote billions and billions for Israel and fend off any criticism of that country. On February 3rd, we had a modest protest outside the offices of one congressperson, Congresswoman Jahana Hayes.
We're here with a protest in front of Jahana Hayes' office, the congresswoman in this district. And the reason is, for years people have tried to speak to her about the Middle East, about the real mistreatment of Palestinians by Israel, and have gotten a deaf ear. She continues to vote big money to Israel and does not do anything to protest what's going on with Palestinians. The particular reason we came out on this very rainy day was the killing by Israel of a Palestinian-American. His name was Omar Abdalmajeed. He was born in Palestine. He was a grocer in Milwaukee for 40 years and then decided to go back to Palestine for his last years. He was about 78 years old. On January 12th at 2 a.m., the Israelis took him out of his car and gagged him and blindfolded him and handcuffed him and roughed him up. And they did this for quite some time. And then after an hour, they just laid him on the ground. They claimed, the soldiers claimed, they thought in this sub-freezing or near-freezing weather, they thought he was sleeping. And they just left. They didn't try to sit him on anything. They didn't try to get an ambulance. They just left. And another Palestinian who had been detained found him unresponsive. They took him to a doctor and he was dead. And, you know, this is just an outrage. It's gotten some publicity because he's an American citizen. And 5 or so, maybe 8 members of Congress have expressed their sentiments and unhappiness and wanting an investigation. We almost immediately told Jahana Hayes, communicated with her staff about this, but there's been no reaction on the part of the Congresswoman. She said nothing, and now weeks have gone by, and there's been no justice for Omar Assad. And so that's the particular reason why we came out today. There are other reasons. This is a picture of our Congresswoman. But, here's one. Groups have talked to her about this situation, the incredible mistreatment of children by the Israelis, and the attempt to get a bill in Congress that would not allow the Israelis to spend our money, our tax money, on mistreatment of children, teenagers, and such. And there's a bill, they call it the McCollum bill, and it's gotten some 32 co-sponsors. And our Congresswoman Jahana Hayes has been appraised of this. There's been meetings with her, and she looks like she's thinking about it, but she never signed. So this youth here is going to read something that was written by a leader of an Israeli human rights group. And his name was his name is Amal Nachle. He was born prematurely. They named him Amal, hope, in hope that he would survive infancy. And he did, but he does have some severe medical problems. When he was 16, the Israelis threw him in prison, and he's been there ever since without any charge mentioned. No one's explained why. This fella from the human rights group, B'Tselem, wrote, "For Israel, Amal is just another Palestinian, a no one. The fact that he just turned 17 and suffered from an autoimmune disease doesn't change that. For over a year now, he's been held in administrative detention, Israel's whitewashed term describing the Kafkaesque routine of indefinitely detaining someone, a no one, without charge or trial." He's been in prison since the start of 2021. Israel extended his non-sentence for the 4th time. News about the death of Omar Assad in Israeli custody has not disappeared from the headlines. Some think it's because he was an American citizen, but that didn't help the family of Rachel Corrie. It's more likely it's because some in the leading political party in the United States are outspoken in their support for Palestinian rights. At any rate, the usual Israeli army investigation that takes months and months was settled in a few weeks. The Israeli military said this week that it would reprimand a senior officer and remove 2 others from leadership roles. As for criminal charges, well, unless there's real anger shown in America, there'll be no real punishment for causing Assad's death. One little act you could take would be to join the hundreds who have signed on to the petition demanding justice for Omar Abdalmajeed Assad. We link from our website. Amnesty International has issued a brand new report on Israel in 277 pages. Amnesty explains that Israel's been an apartheid state from the beginning. Of course, the Israeli government condemned the report. There's no better way to refute their nonsense than to listen to Israeli columnist Gideon Levy, who wrote an article in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz called "Tell Me What's Untrue About the Amnesty Report." He begins, "As the curses and screeches subside, Amnesty are anti-Semites, the report is full of lies, the methodology is absurd. One must ask, what precisely is incorrect in the apartheid report?" Later he writes, "The international report has yet to be born that Israel won't denounce while neglecting to respond to a single point it makes. One organization after another, some of them important and honest, call it apartheid, and Israel says anti-Semitism." He goes on with example after example of apartheid, though the article's in a paywall, we'll link to it on The Struggle. Come to think of it, maybe there's a better way to respond. It comes from questions issued by White House reporter Matthew Lee. He works for the Associated Press. At a State Department briefing, the spokesperson, Ned Price, when asked about the Amnesty report, said the department doesn't comment on outside reports.
Matthew Lee countered, "But you certainly cite them quite a bit in your own human rights report." And I went back and looked, and in terms of just the last human rights report, cited Amnesty International on Ethiopia, on Cuba, on China, on Xinjiang, on Iran, on Burma, on Syria. Quite a zinger. It's enough to give hypocrisy a bad name. Now, from Amnesty International, a portion of their latest video on Israel.
When you hear the word apartheid, what do you think of? Probably the disturbing images of racial segregation between whites and blacks in South Africa, where a regime ruled by a racist white minority declared themselves officially superior to the black majority, then proceeded to dominate them. South Africa's apartheid system officially ended in the mid-1990s, but that doesn't mean apartheid can't happen elsewhere. Here, in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, Palestinians are being forced off their land and out of their homes, separated and segregated by laws, walls, and checkpoints. They live in a constant state of fear and insecurity, and deliberately impoverished. While, on the other hand, Israeli authorities have given the Jewish Israeli population privilege over Palestinians in just about every facet of life. The question is, does this all amount to the crime of apartheid? First, the definition of apartheid. The crime against humanity of apartheid is perpetrated when particular serious human rights violations are committed with the purpose of establishing and maintaining a system of domination by one racial group over another and systematically oppressing them. But does this system exist in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories?
And there's been a growing debate about whether the situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories is apartheid. And now is the time for us, as the world's largest human rights organization, to offer up our analysis. Our findings and criticism are directed not at the Jewish people, but at the Israeli state. It's the Israeli state that put in place the policies that implement the laws and the practices that oppress Palestinians.
Well, Israeli leaders have been clear about their intentions from the beginning. In 1948, just before he became the first Prime Minister of Israel, Ben-Gurion visited Lifta and other Palestinian areas near Jerusalem that were completely emptied of Palestinian residents following attacks by Jewish forces. He stated, "There are no Arabs, 100% Jews. If we persist, it is quite possible that in the next 6 or 8 months there will be considerable changes in the country, very considerable, and to our advantage." More than 70 years later, then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu posted on Instagram that Israel is not a state of all its citizens, but rather the nation-state of the Jewish people and only them. So, it's no surprise that Israel built a system of racially discriminatory laws, policies, and practices that privilege only Jewish people. And Palestinians, well, Palestinians live there too. They were there before Israel was established. But, as we will explain, they've been trapped for decades in a system that treats them as a lesser, non-Jewish racial group. Before Israel was established in 1948, Palestinians comprised most of the population, around 70%, and owned the vast majority of private land, about 90%, in what was British Mandate Palestine. Jews, many of whom had emigrated from Europe, comprised around 30% of the population, and they and Jewish institutions owned about 6.5% of the land.
The port of Haifa in Palestine lies shattered by bombs and strewn with dead.
In the course of establishing Israel as a Jewish state in 1948, Israeli authorities acted to turn the situation on its head and were responsible for the mass expulsion of Palestinians and the destruction of hundreds of villages, forcing around 800,000 Palestinians out of their homes and lands. Thousands of Palestinians and Jews were killed in the context of attacks on civilians during this conflict. Today there are around 6 million Palestinian refugees who Israel denies the right to return to their homes. After the 1967 war, Israel occupied the Palestinian territories of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. Israel's brutal military rule, coupled with the establishment and expansion of illegal Jewish settlements, has coerced Palestinians into enclaves, creating further fragmentation and segregation. The objective? Maintain Jewish-Israeli hegemony and maximize control of land. In the city of Jerusalem, the Israeli official policy is to maintain at least a 60% Jewish majority.
If you've always felt a deep yearning for Jerusalem, now is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity not only to stand within its gates, but also to build the home of your dreams there.
So where do all the Palestinians live now? 3.4 million live outside of Israel in the occupied territories, mainly in refugee camps in neighbouring countries. 2.5 million Palestinians live in Israel and East Jerusalem, restricted to enclaves that make up around 3% of the entire area. 3 million Palestinians live in the occupied West Bank, but are only allowed to access 40% of the land to live and work. The rest of the area is for the Jewish Israeli settlers only. 2 million are trapped in the Gaza Strip, one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Fragmentation of the Palestinian society and the dispossession of their lands are key pillars of Israel's apartheid system to maintain domination and control. But there's more. The unequal structure of nationality and status, restrictions on freedom of movement, use of military rule, denial of right to political participation or the right to peaceful protest, and cruel separation of families all add to the complex system that we see today.
The world in general hasn't woken up to the fact that there is an entrenched system of oppression against Palestinians across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, wherever they may live, by the Israeli state. It's a system that's been put in place and maintained for decades, and it's that system that is the root cause of so many of the violations, the misery and the suffering that millions of Palestinians face on a daily basis.
We'll get to Ukraine in a moment, but first I want to say that on Tuesday, February 8th, there'll be a big climate march in Hartford, Connecticut, starting at 2 p.m., beginning at the Old State House. Its main sponsor is the Connecticut Citizen Action Group, but there's 20 other co-sponsors, including the Sierra Club, the Connecticut Climate Crisis Mobilization, No More Dirty Power in Killingly, and many others. Much of the U.S. anti-war movement, which appears to have lost its mind, is opposing U.S. war with Russia, but without criticizing the fact that Putin has soldiers on Ukraine's border with Russia, Belarus, and in the Crimea. The Crimea is that part of Ukraine that Putin stole in 2014. The anti-war types described above embrace the brilliant analysis: U.S. imperialism bad, Russia good. At least some on the left in Britain are more clear-eyed and believe there should be solidarity with the people of Ukraine. About 100 gathered in front of the RT building. RT stands for Russia Today, the infamous propaganda channel completely tied in with Putin's government. The rally they held was called Hands Off Ukraine. Ukrainian scholar Sasha Dovshik spoke, saying that Ukraine was a country situated between Europe and hell. Nadia Whittome is a Labour Party member of Parliament and an unabashed socialist.
We're standing outside Russia Today, a state-controlled propaganda machine for the Kremlin. The director of broadcasting described Ukrainians as, and I quote, animals, and said, "There is no Ukraine, it is just Russian land." As we know, in 1932 to 1933, millions of Ukrainians died of famine in what is known as the Holodomor. This was a man-made famine caused by Stalin's policies. Villages and towns in Ukraine were blacklisted to prevent them from receiving food. People were forbidden to leave Ukraine. The famine provided cover for a campaign of repression and persecution that was carried out against Ukrainian culture and society. It was genocide. So for the Russian state broadcaster to describe Ukrainians with such dehumanizing language, to deny their right to self-determination, is completely abhorrent. We must fight against imperialism on every front. We must demand that Russia dial back the threats, the arms race and the militarization. And we must also demand the same of NATO, neither Washington nor Moscow. Boris Johnson's now talking tough on Ukraine as part of his flood of distractions from the Partygate scandal. And we can't let him, because the people of Ukraine are not pawns in anyone's political game. They're not to be used by rulers of superpowers in geopolitical games. This war must be ended by civil society, by self-determination, not military action. It will be the people of Ukraine who suffer if it doesn't, and it's with them that we stand in total solidarity. Hands off Ukraine.
Neither Washington nor Moscow. That's the point. Paul Mason is a journalist and author. He addressed the journalists in the Russia Today building directly in his speech and expressed solidarity with the people of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus.
Here in Britain, we value freedom of speech. But there's a difference between freedom of speech and incitement to violence. What Anton Krasovsky did through Russia Today was incitement to violence. As a journalist, I've seen it many times. It wasn't just the denial of the existence of the Ukrainian people, which is dangerous enough in itself in a period of heightened tension. It was a threat of sexual violence. It was a gesture that says sexual violence will happen to men and women when we invade. As a journalist, I'm sorry to say, especially because there are children and young people in this audience, we've seen time and again that one speech, one gesture like that is worth 1,000 torture cases, 1,000 rapes, 1,000 massacres. We see it in Rwanda, we see it in Serbia. And my request to the colleagues of RT, of course everybody has to work for assholes. Most journalists work for organisations they don't like. But you do not need to run incitement to violence by this guy who is the chief spokesperson of the Kremlin. So next time it happens, by all means take your salary. By all means go to work. But pull off air these incitements to violence. And of course the final thing which is to say, we have Belarusians here, we have Ukrainians here, I'm British. Truth is international. The fight for human rights and truth is international. And there is nowhere more than the fight where that fight is needed than inside the Russian Federation itself, inside Kazakhstan, in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in Yekaterinburg, in Kazan. That is where our message is aimed today. It is not against the Russian people, our message is to them. We have a common interest with you in overthrowing all the oligarchic regimes, all the lying TV stations, and coming to find the truth that we, working class people, the world over know already. The only enemy we have is the rich, the oligarchs, and the lying media.
There was an interesting message from a group in Ukraine called the Social Movement. I'll read it as pictures of the rally are shown. There was an interesting message from a group of Ukrainians in Ukraine called the Social Movement. I'll read from it while other pictures of the rally are shown. The Social Movement considers that de-escalation requires the following steps: withdrawal of Russian troops from Donbass, creation of an international program to restore the war-torn region and help its inhabitants, including the confiscation of looted Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs, revision of the social economic course proposed to Ukraine by the West, Instead of destructive neoliberal reforms under IMF pressure, write off Ukraine's external debt. More inclusive and progressive humanitarian policies in Ukraine, ending impunity for Ukrainian far right and repealing decommunization laws, ensuring guarantees of human rights for those who lived in the DPR, Donetsk People's Republic, and LPR, Luhansk People's Republic, the adoption of an amnesty law for those who did not commit war crimes. Their statement concludes, "Long live anti-war solidarity for democracy and socialism." I'll conclude our coverage of Ukraine with this message from the British National Union of Mine Workers, which was read at the protest. The NUM wishes to express its support to the people of Ukraine. We have been watching with interest the news reports in the UK in relation to the increasing tensions on the Ukrainian-Russian border. It is concerning, the buildup of Russian troops in the area, and it is our sincere hope that a diplomatic solution will be found, resulting in a de-escalation of tensions. Ukraine is an independent, sovereign state, and its people should be allowed to determine their own destiny free of external influence and pressure, for and on behalf of the National Union of Mine Workers. Notice there's nothing in the rally calling for support either of NATO or U.S. troop movements or even the present composition of the Ukrainian government. Neither Washington nor Moscow. It was a left slogan during the Cold War, and it needs to be revived for use again today. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.